On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nathan Dize, Assistant Professor of French at Washington University in St. Louis, and his work is situated at the intersection of French Caribbean literary and intellectual history, African diaspora studies, and translation studies. He is currently working on two projects: Attending to the Dead, Haitian Literature and the Practice of Mourning, and Handle with Care, The Legacies of African American Translators of Francophone Literature. Dr. Dize is also a translator of Haitian literature, and his translations include the novels Duels by Nahemi Dahomey, The Immortals and the Emperor by Mackenzie Orsell, I Am Alive by Ketley Mars, and Antoine of Gommiers by Lionel Trulio. He is also a founding member of the Kwasman Va Collective, a member of the digital networks of Fan Rebel and Rendering Revolution, Sartorial Approaches to Haitian History. He is also a founding editor of the Digital History Project, A Colony in Crisis, the Saint-Domingue Grain Shortage of 1789. He is a co-editor of the Global Black Writers in Translation series at Vanderbilt University Press. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Nathan Dize, Assistant Professor of French at Washington University in St. Louis. His work is situated at the intersection of French Caribbean literary and intellectual history, African diaspora studies, translation studies. How are you doing today, Dr. Dize?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing good. So, we can get into it. So, how did you get into Black studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to the field? And I actually have a follow-up question for you because I'm very interested in what drew you to Haitian translation specifically, because that is a very specific niche to be in.
Yeah, so I was sort of doing I'm really interested in genealogy and the idea of like sort of archaeology of like intellectual thought and things like that. So I was sort of doing a bit of my own, like where did it begin? How did it begin? And really a credit to my first high school French teachers. One was from Martinique, one was African American, whose father had served in the military and lived in France. I believe in Lorraine, although not during World War II or anything like that, but sort of a military family. And so the beginnings of learning French were very much also steeped in an awareness that Black people also speak French and that there are historical reasons for this, that it's rooted. And when I got to the University of Maryland, my first sort of like going through like my semesters there as an undergraduate, the first semester I had Sharon Harley, Zeta Nunez, and Valerie Orlando, who's in the French department. And it sort of comes as no surprise then that I would be enthralled by all of their work, by the way they teach, by the way they think about sort of histories of Black life, both in its dispersal throughout space, particularly the Americas and the Caribbean, but also wanting to know more about like all of the hands that were involved in making all of this cultural work, keeping it alive, bringing it forward, translating it. In that class with Valerie Orlando, I think we read 14 or 15 books, which for a 200 level class at the undergraduate level is a lot. A lot of people felt a certain way about that, but I was just like, can I have more? And all of the work was in translation. And so it sort of got the wheels turning a bit as to like, well, I'm coming to this study of Afro-French life, African and Caribbean life and literature through translation. There are other hands involved here. Fast forward many years before I actually started doing any of that work myself, but the question of translation had always been really important to me. One, because I wouldn't have been able to encounter the work without it initially. I was working my way through a French major at the University of Maryland, but if I had waited to read any of the literature by the time I got to the ability of reading any of it in French, I'm not sure that the flame would have been still lit.
Mhm.
Maybe it would have. I don't know. We can't run that experiment. But that's where it all began. And then I think too, another sort of really important moment was it was in another French class, but this time it was a 20th century theater class, where that had nothing to do with Haiti, nothing to do with the Caribbean. But the final project was, okay, we've read all of this French theater from the 20th century. Now go out and find a play that's interesting to you, that fits with um, your subject area interest, your cultural area interest. And this was in a class with Caroline Eads at the University of Maryland during my master's program. And the University of Maryland Libraries, McKeldin, never ceases to amaze me what they have.
Mhm.
And I came across this play, an 1896 play by a Haitian writer named Valmenes Ducasse about the final moments of Toussaint Louverture's life in French prison. And it's a sort of a 5-act historical play um, about all of the people, the Napoleonic like
Mhm.
soldiers and jailers that Toussaint Louverture encounters in his 8-month period in prison, and sort of taking them to task for all of the crimes that they had committed against Haiti in this very short 29, 30-page play. And from there, the rest is history. I continued to be super fascinated in the story of Toussaint Louverture's death, so much so that it's all the way into the first chapter of my forthcoming book. And yeah, Haitian studies, Haitian literature has always been very important to my orientation towards Black studies. And it will come, as some of your listeners might be very aware of this, but the Haitian Studies Association is actually located in the Center for Black Studies at the University of Santa Barbara. So I see the two as being very inextricably linked. And sort of, it's hard to pinpoint when and where Black studies became part of my orientation as a scholar and intellectual, but I think um, it's definitely comes through Haiti in some regard.
Thank you. So, building on that, right? You are in French, um, but your work looks at the literary and intellectual history of the French Caribbean and diaspora studies, and of course, translation studies. How do you situate yourself in relationship to the multiple fields and disciplines that your work crosses?
Sure. Yeah, and I think this is something that's the French department um traditionally has been one that sort of like edifies France, right? You get a degree in French literature. It's very much about the French canon. And something that happened um around like the 1980s is that French departments started to hire or had scholars who switched gears a little bit to start study the Caribbean or African literature written in French. Um, this has various different histories depending on where you are. If you're in the United States, if you're in the UK, if you're elsewhere in the world, but there was one person usually who did this, and so it was uh, everybody else is doing France, and then the one person is doing not France. Um, and um, that is kind of how I came to understand like situating myself within a French department. Um, which is to say that it's not like I'm the only person out here studying the Caribbean or African diaspora literature in French. It's just there is rarely a French department that has multiple people who
Mhm.
study those areas. Um, Certainly not two Caribbeanists, although there are some exceptions. Um, and in that way, a lot of the times it's sort of it feels like it's a bit myself against the French department or against the French discipline, against the French canon. Which isn't to say I don't get along with my colleagues or haven't gotten along with people in the programs that I've been a part of. It's just always having to make that sort of push to say, well, what about not France? What other places have historical time? What other places have literary histories? What other places have intellectual genealogies? And a lot, in my case, that has been sort of looking at Haiti, but also other places in the Caribbean, or in the question of translation, who's doing the work of translating the work from African countries, Caribbean countries, and what do they bring to bear in the study of or the presentation of those works. And so, as I said, I'm very fascinated by genealogy. So essentially going and looking for who had been doing the work in the past. People like Michael Dash, who was at the University of the West Indies, but then moved on to NYU, was a translator of Edouard Glissant, somebody that a lot of people know through Caribbean discourse in English, but only know Caribbean discourse in English because of Michael Dash. Not saying that somebody else wouldn't have come along and translated it, but we're reading Michael Dash as we're reading Edouard Glissant in English in that particular text. Betsy Wing is another person who translated Poetic of Relation by Glissant. So we know their presentations of the work, and in that way, they're also grounded in a discipline of French studies, but bringing to bear knowledge from the Caribbean or from other systems of thought. And so a lot of the times in the French studies space, it's, well, I do Francophone Caribbean studies, or I do some hyphenated version of French studies. There was a very exciting conference in 2024 in the fall, sort of inaugurating the beginning of a project that's been going on for a long time, but Black French studies. What does that look like? It was called Global Black French Studies. Well, what does it mean then to have Caribbeanists, Africanists, Europeanists who are looking through the lens of the question of Blackness, and sort of pointing out the dead ends that French studies has had, or that Caribbean studies has had with reference to Francophone Caribbean, or that Black studies has had with respect to multilingualism. So yeah, a lot of the times it's looking into history to find the people who had been asking these questions before, to essentially feel like, because not that there's nothing new, but that people have been asking these questions in different ways for a long time. One of the ways that it comes up in my work is in the translation space, or in the French language pedagogy space. Where, for instance, somebody like W. Mercer Cook, who co-translated Masters of the Dew by Jacques Roumain with Langston Hughes, he, for a long time, taught in the only master's degree program in French in any HBCU in the United States. And he trained 6 or 7 African-American women in the 1930s and 40s at Atlanta University, who went on to have decade-long careers at a myriad of other HBCUs throughout the Eastern United States. And so then when you start to look at Mercer Cook as like sort of an origin point for French language pedagogy, and looking at Blackness in French, or Black people in France or in other French-speaking places, then his students then go out and start to teach that. And that awareness creates momentum and creates movement. And I'm very much fascinated by that. Definitely sort of as part of a understanding of my own personal intellectual trajectory, trained by or brought up by Afro-descended women in a French language classroom, French language space, but also then looking for antecedents to the thinking and the teaching, and the kind of teaching that inspires me to keep doing the work I do.
Thank you. So I have 2 questions, but I want to build on what you just said with, like, the pedagogy piece, right? So how have your experiences and, like, understanding and searching that trajectory, understanding the genealogy, thinking about the ways in which French studies has traditionally operated versus, one, how you were introduced to it, but also understanding, like, or being aware of the ways in which Black and French happen, different places, right?
Mhm.
How does that inform your work as a teacher?
Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of the historical situatedness and, like, how Black and French happens at the same point, or at the same moment, something like having an understanding of Creole languages as a Caribbeanist has been something that, absolutely shifted, um, the way that I go about my work, my understanding of the frame of reference that's happening when a Haitian writer takes to the page as a native Haitian Creole speaker, but somebody who's writing in French.
Mhm.
Um, it's really interesting to me that a lot of the time, actually, I would say predominantly, Haitian writers who write in French are not they're not ever referred to as exophonous writers, writers who write in a language other than their native tongue. But in a certain way, they kind of are.
Yeah.
Um, but there's also scholars who have framed it differently or framed it in a way that I think is also generative. Kayama Glover has talked about in a couple interviews the idea of a Haitian French. Nadev Menel has also talked about sort of the myth of the monolingual Haitian, like the Haitians in a certain sense, especially metropolitan ones, folks living in Port-au-Prince or living in diaspora are always multilingual, rather than monolingual in Haitian Creole. And so when you have knowledge of Haitian Creole and you take to reading a text that has usually been read in a French studies or a French literary space, all sorts of other things start to come up. Um, Modes of phrasing things, flora, fauna, other sorts of like beyond the idea of like local color or folk culture, something that's very familiar to like, New Negro literature, Harlem Renaissance literature, where like folk is sort of inserted or played
Mhm.
up as part of the aesthetic. Instead, Haitian Creole is part of the language and part of the aesthetics itself. Um, so I would say that's a really important point of like how they both happen in the same time, French and Black people speaking French. I'm not an Africanist. It would be fascinating to hear an Africanist's response to this question. Um, but as a Caribbeanist, it comes a lot through Creole, and understanding like the depth of reference that happens when, like in proverbial speech, or even just the situatedness of like elder knowledge or ancestral knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, and to your other point, if you could remind me of the beginning of your question. um,
So, yeah, it was about how does all of this, right? And I actually am glad that you went down that path first because I was gonna ask you about that. The translation piece is very fascinating to me, and how you are able to, um really think about the context within which this is written, and if you're dealing with people who are native Creole speakers, like, that is different than being, like, French France speaker, like, it's a different
Totally.
thing, but how does this play out in the classroom, right? So you mentioned,
Mhm.
like, the way that French pedagogy grew in the US around the HBCUs and the way that you were introduced to it. How does that inform how you show this to students and introduce them so that they can too know that, like, there are different contexts here, there are different things to consider than just maybe in a more traditional French literary course.
Sure. Yeah, one of the ways this happens, in courses that I teach, I have a course on zombies, vampires, and spirits in the Francophone Caribbean, and students come to that class with, I guess, a belief already that they know what they're in for. They know what zombies are culturally. They know what vampires are through frame of reference, pop culture, um, all sorts of things like that. And the idea of spirits, every religion has spirits as part of its orientation to the sacred or to the spiritual nature of the
Mhm,
religion. Um, but then when we start to sift through the layers, and go back to some of the origins of what a zombie is, for instance. It's rooted in the occupation of Haiti by the United States from 1915 to 1934, and movies and travel logs that get published in the late 20s and early 30s that essentially create this idea of somebody who is possessed, which, as that representation continues to roll down the hill and gain momentum, it gets further and further away from Haitian spiritual ideas of spirit zombies, um, the zombie as a metaphor for enslavement, or even something like what maybe Orlando Patterson would call it, like the status of social death,
Mhm.
rather than sort of somebody who's been imperiled by being transformed into um, a mindless creature by some sort of sorcerer. And then we sort of start to unpack what sorcery means. Right? There's an interview that I did with a translator who had translated a novel by Kedley Mars called Savage Seasons, and it was clear to me in talking with her that her frame of reference for what spirituality was, what Vodou was, what Haitian religious culture was very much part of a Western frame, and that the
Mm.
way that she approached her translation was sort of like some sort of alchemical, like 19th century French idea of what spirituality should be, and that spirituality that's not Christian is other. Um, and I think depending on where the student is situated, where they're coming from, they might also come to class with that idea. And so really sort of patiently walking them through um, Haitian religious culture, walking them through terms and terminology that are rooted in Haitian Creole language, and ways of knowing. I was at the Haitian Studies Conference this year, and somebody started talking about the idea of Haitian epistemologies, and somebody sort of very kindly in the room said, "Well, epistemology is also a Western term. So what would you call that in Haitian Creole?" It's like, well, you call that connaissance, you would call that knowledge. Um, and reminding students, and I think students are very open to this, especially students who walk into a cultural studies classroom about the Caribbean. Um, they're open to learning new ways of understanding the world. And if you remind them that they are situated somewhere, that they have a past, they have a history of sort of a family past, a spiritual past, I find that they're more likely to delve into the situatedness of someone else, and treat that situatedness with respect and endeavor to try to understand like what all of that situatedness means.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Um, so I know we have 2 questions left, but I did wanna ask about some of the digital work that you do
Yeah.
around these things as well. So can you just speak a little bit about, I guess there are several different projects that you're a part of, but I think it would be interesting to hear more about those because the accessibility, right, of these ideas is growing with the ability to be digital and to share ideas across space and time in very different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll talk about two. One that actually began at the University of Maryland. It's called A Colony in Crisis, and it's a digital historical document reader. And what it began as is I was working in Hornbeck Library, filling out a spreadsheet about a 12,000 piece collection of French pamphlets from the late 15th century to the early 19th century. And there was a subset that was called France and its Colonies. And in that subset of about 500 pamphlets, there was this historical episode of colonials in Saint-Domingue, the country now known as Haiti, that had made up this idea that there was a famine in the colony, and that if tax laws were not were not suspended, and the colony was not able to do free trade with the United States, with the burgeoning United States and other places in the Caribbean, then the colony would die, it was France's most profitable colony, and that all of the wealth would start to disappear. This was sort of a way of the planter class trying to take back some more power and increase their profits. They said that the enslaved were being fed through the similar food ways that the colonials were being fed, bread. We know this to not be true, this to be a complete fabrication. And yet somehow they were taking this to the French National Assembly. And so in sort of presenting this historical moment through translation, excerpting and translating pieces of documents to sort of help illuminate what was happening and allow these documents to be put to use in classrooms, we sort of started to see like the cracks in this narrative, how this famine was entirely made up, and how in colonial documents, the only people who were able to speak actually were French officials in France and colonials in Saint-Domingue. These colonials were not a monolith, though. There were free people of color who owned property, including human property, as well as French-descended Creoles who had made life in the French colonies for a number of decades. And yet it felt very important because this was happening at the outbreak of the French Revolution and on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. And it was all sort of part of the rumbling of the volcano that then led to the Haitian Revolution. But unless you speak French, these documents can't be used. And so I worked together with a colleague of mine in my cohort, as well as a librarian, Kelsey Rivera, who's now at the Library of Congress, to put together like a website to translate some of these to allow for students who did not have French to be able to use them in the classroom space or in a research capacity. That then evolved into the story being too big to tell in just a small subset of documents. We started out with 12. I think in total there are about 24 on the website. And then in 2016, we were approached by students and professors at Montclair State University wishing to translate the website into Haitian Creole and to do audio recordings of the Creole translations so that people who speak Creole and understand Creole can hear it, but who may not be able to read it could then listen to history being told to them as though they were sitting before this colonial document in a university archive in a state or a country, perhaps, that they do not have access to. And so the doing of that really sort of caused me to believe that access is one of those really important pieces that the digital humanities, like a digital humanities approach, can help sort of mitigate. Don't want to say solve because, tomorrow the servers could be turned off, right? And another project I'm a part of is called Croisement Voix, New Paths for Caribbean Literature. And this is a project that I put together with a group of friends of mine who are all professors of French and scholars of Francophone Caribbean studies. And this was like some pandemic energy. We were all very restless and, seeing books and things like that coming out, but having no way of actually going to book talks or being, in conversation with authors locally. Or some of us were situated in the United States. Some of us at the time were in France or elsewhere. And it was really like, well, why don't we just leverage our university Zoom accounts to sort of creating a space for people to gather and talk about these new books that are being published because publishing didn't stop. People just stopped being able to access the authors. And so we, over the course of a number of years, have hosted 3 to 4 per semester book talks online that have really sort of provided a launch pad for scholars encountering authors whom they may have never had a chance to read, but also allowing authors who are putting out new work or maybe emerging writers to find their audience across the Atlantic or other spaces. We've interviewed people in the Caribbean, in the United States, as well as in France and Europe. So it's been a very exciting project, and really a all hands on deck sort of. We have an idea, we have a dream, let's make it happen, and some real like kinship and community building has happened too, where we're all sort of in this together, especially as all of us are going through the pre-tenure to tenure track. One cannot have enough support in that period of time.
For sure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So what interests you most about the past of Black studies or Caribbean studies as a Caribbeanist, in both critical and excited senses?
Yeah. I'll take you back to another sort of pandemic moment. I was working on my dissertation and getting very fatigued by the topic. My dissertation was on death and mourning in Haitian literary studies, and when there was so much public dying happening, it became very heavy to work on, and so I had to take a pretty serious hiatus between about March to maybe like July. But in that time, I just started reading again, and I started reading The Big Sea by Langston Hughes, and became very excited in the sort of the African American writers who spent time in France or had cause to speak French or be in community or conversation with writers from the Caribbean, which led me to a fascination in Jessie Redmond Fawcett that has not ceased. Come to find out that Jessie Redmond Fawcett was, depending on who you asked, one of the most talented speakers of French of the Harlem Renaissance generation or of the 20th century African American writers. She translated Haitian literature. She wrote articles on Haiti and the Francophone Caribbean for the crisis. And she, I think it was one of the many creative projects that she saw as an outlet for her creative energies, and a way that I think a lot of scholars have interpreted as part of her Francophilia writ large. But she does take a bit of a Caribbean pivot in about 1922 when she translates a poem by one of the playwrights whose work I'm interested in my dissertation and my book. And so I'm like, oh, Jessie Redmond Fawcett was also fascinated by Massillon Kwaku. So like, here we go, kinship. And that piece of the past of Black studies has been so fascinating to me about, seeing who rubbed elbows with whom. For instance, as Jessie Redmond Fawcett is traveling with W.E.B. Du Bois to the Second Pan-African Congress. The University of Massachusetts Amherst libraries have pieces of like correspondence that Du Bois had written to somebody, for instance, like Paul Panda, Congolese intellectual and politician, and on the top is scrawled in pencil, "Please translate." Like, Jessie, please translate. And we're like, well, that is Jessie Redmond Fawcett being W.E.B. Du Bois's translator. That is so fascinating. And then you sort of just think about all the possibilities of what work was then made possible by this person, by Fawcett, being in the room with somebody who gets a lot of attention in cultural and intellectual history, but whom without Fawcett may not have been able to fully participate in that moment, right? So this has led me to a second book project on the legacies of African American translators of Francophone African and Caribbean literature. And I have an article coming in Palimpsest about Jesse Redmond Fawcett's sort of turn to Haitian literature in the September 1920 issue of The Crisis, where she not only provides a sort of overview of Haitian literary history, but sort of argues that literature is a crucial way of understanding Haiti's place in the world, and therefore understanding how Haitians have always resisted ideas of segregation, colorism, or sort of a chauvinistic approach to cultural difference through religion, right? The demonization of Vodou that took place in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s by the United States and other countries. So all of these, who was in the room when it happened, sort of like genealogical, archaeological sort of moments are super fascinating to me. I think a lot of people have written about the Civic Club moment, where Jesse Redmond Fawcett's Thunder was ceremoniously stolen by Alan Locke et al. But you have also, Langston Hughes calling her one of the midwives of the Harlem Renaissance, alongside two men, right? Charles S. Johnson and Alan Locke. So these are some of the really exciting things. I think what makes it challenging in the critical way is actually it was challenging for me to figure out how to write about some of the frictions in that intellectual history where revered scholars of Black studies, thinking like people like Cheryl Wall or other people who are not trained French studies scholars, who are not trained comparative literature scholars, not necessarily going down the road of like, well, what was Jesse Redmond Fawcett actually like as a translator? Let's look at let's do the comparative work of looking at the original and looking at her translation, seeing what's happening here. Rather than saying these scholars were wrong or just weren't interested in the question, thinking, well, no, actually, it's not part of the disciplinary training for an English studies scholar to be, or English literary studies scholars to be looking at what's going on in French or what is the cultural purchase of talking about Haitian literature in an African-American periodical. I think comparatists do ask these sorts of questions, but taking into account like all of that's going on, like one can't do everything, and that's why we need these layers of intellectual history and analysis.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, last question. What interests or excites you most about the present and future of the field?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be excited about. I'm a glass half full person, and I think from somebody who's in a modern languages department, a Romance language studies department, I find it very exciting to see French studies, Germanic studies, Hispanic studies, Italian studies starting to ask questions or to look into the past of their disciplines to understand when the question of Blackness or anti-Blackness was being raised, and to start to actually look at who was doing the work, how the work was being done, and what the future of the discipline is if anti-Blackness is not understood, contextualized, and examined. I see this with Italian studies colleagues of mine who are talking about multicultural Italy, sort of looking at Italian colonization of Eritrea and Ethiopia, which, I feel like for a discipline that is so deeply grounded in ideas of the Renaissance, to have a sort of idea of like modern Italy is already pretty transgressive. And for caucuses like the Afro-German caucus at the German Studies Association, or these conferences like I was telling you about, the Global Black French Studies Conference, scholars have been doing the work all along. Um, but I think there's a real movement to sort of make the gathering spaces happen. Um, whether that's people who have long had tenure really taking leadership and making it happen, or for editorial spaces to open up in journals to make space for these types of contributions, or even the digital space opening up and providing a sort of a way to um, sort of curate and gather where new questions can be asked, or iterations or variations on an old question. A sort of a sticky, thorny question can really sort of be examined. Um, I think another, we've talked about translation studies a bit, or the idea of translation, but um, translation studies as a field is starting to become very focused on translators as individuals, as intellectual thought partners with the authors themselves. And as I was talking to you about Jessie Robin Fawcett, that sort of movement in translation studies no longer falls parallel to the idea of like, oh, was Jessie Robin Fawcett a faithful translator of Haitian literature? Rather, by looking at what she did and saying, oh, this is what she is creating out of this work, speaks to her intellectual engagement with the text. It
Mhm.
may not need to even be a one for one or a faithful translation or whatever that even means, but rather it's, here is a moment of her creativity and being inspired by a work by an author with whom she felt a connection, with whom she felt a kindred sort of poetics. And that speaks multitudes. Um, and so, yeah, this sort of question about like the individual and how they position themselves as a creative, I think is very generative and exciting about the future. That said, I think there are also a lot of challenges. Um, and, but I still see, especially in the graduate students that I'm working with in my department, but also encountering out in professional spaces, that the future is bright. And um, that supporting emerging scholars and early career scholars is really important. Making sure everybody is able to keep their heads up because the world's going to throw all sorts of stuff at you, and we've got to be in this together.
Yes, we do. And that is a wonderful place to leave it on my end. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I'd like to thank you and the whole team at the Black Studies Pod for the work that you do. It is so inspiring to be able to, on my walk to work, my 20 minutes to and fro, to be able to dive really deeply into someone else's brain, to listen to the exchanges and to just get inspired as I make my way from one desk to another. And when I'm not working too, I think the ideas and the level of discourse really keeps me going. And there's also quite a bit of laughing and fun had. So I think yeah, it's just it's really wonderful work that you're doing, and just keep doing it as long as it fuels you.
Thank you so much. We definitely plan to keep doing it as long as people such as yourself keep saying yes. We're gonna keep having conversation. Um, because it has been a very rewarding experience. So I'm glad that other people find value in it because it has definitely been helpful in this moment for me and John, and I'm sure Olivia and Brielle as well. So
Yeah, for sure. And I would say also just listening to you and John interact with the students you work with. It's really inspiring for me as someone who is beginning to work with undergraduate students in research capacities to have a model for how to go about this work ethically, and how to really just be open to the exchange of knowledge between undergraduate students and yourself, or graduate students and yourself. And yeah, just always being humble enough to learn and learn with people in community.
Well, thank you so, so much. Thank you again for your
You're
time,
welcome.
and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Same to you.